looking forward to hearing his research today about survey question bias. Aaron.
Thanks, Guy. What Connor didn't mention is I'm also the coordinator emeritus of this workshop. I'm really glad to be able to come and present my work, having run it several years ago. Well, anyway, thanks everybody for coming. Today, I'm going to talk to you about survey bias, specifically partisan survey bias, which we'll get to in a minute. Here is the official presidential job performance poll put out by the GOP. How would you rate President Trump's job performance so far? Great, good, okay, or other? The following question, by the way, asks the same thing about Barack Obama, except the options are great, good, okay, and bad. Here's another one. Do you believe that the mainstream media does their due diligence fact-checking before publishing stories on the Trump administration? And do you believe the media fails to report on Democrats' scandals? I really like this one. This one presupposes, it builds into the question the notion that there are Democratic scandals that go unreported. So these questions are obviously biased. It's clear to us that they're biased. It might not matter, though. For example, if there are all these survey questions running around, and they all have these biases, but no one reads the surveys, no one takes them, no one thinks about them, and no one actually looks at the results, then there might be no problem with having survey bias at all. Unfortunately, we think that's not the case. There's big literature suggesting that survey wording affects responses to those surveys. And importantly, viewing survey results affects preferences of people who did not take the surveys. And even more, these effects can be very large. So if it's the case that we have these bias surveys floating around, hundreds at any one time, and looking at and taking bias surveys skews preferences, then the net effect of these surveys can only be perverse for the state of the Democratic polity. Now, lest I be accused of raising questions that I have no intention of addressing, in this talk I'm going to do a few things. The first is going to be introducing a text-as-data model to measure and estimate survey partisan bias. Then I'm going to show some results using the Roper Center's iPoll database, in which I've scored the bias on hundreds of thousands of survey questions over several decades. And then I'm going to show you some tools that I've built to let any survey researcher or academic use this model for themselves. So let's get into measuring partisan survey bias. Let's consider an experiment in which we're going to measure survey bias as a treatment effect. Let's take, for example, that question I had earlier about estimating about media bias, about whether or not there are the media fails to report on Democrat scandals. So we can all imagine that there are different ways to ask that question, some of which are going to be more biased than others. So we can write a less plausibly biased question that kind of asks the same concept. Then we can collect some survey respondents, and we can randomly assign half of these survey respondents to get our version of the survey, the plausibly less biased one, and then half receive the GOP poll. Now we can calculate a difference in means in the number of people who give either the liberal or conservative answer to this question, and that difference in means, for all intents and purposes, is the survey bias. What we're saying is one question has this biased effect relative to the other. The problem with this, if we want to estimate survey bias at scale, is that it doesn't. We have to ask many, many versions of this experiment if we want to estimate as few as like 5 or 6 measures of survey bias. And it's also noisy, because we have to get these results from actually looking at survey respondents. There's going to be error just from measurement. Now, there's another way we could go about trying to measure survey bias, and this one might be considered the gold standard. This is what we've done for decades. We rely on the literature. We read a lot of papers about things like survey non-response bias, or item non-response bias, or social desirability bias, or framing and priming bias, or accessibility bias, dog whistles, survey mode bias, all these different types of biases. We read all these papers, we think really hard, we look at the survey questions that we've written, and then we decide that probably we've done our best and that none of these are really going to matter. Of course, this is also subjective and inaccurate, but importantly, it still doesn't scale. If we'd like to estimate, as I mentioned, the bias for hundreds of thousands of surveys at any one time, we can't just have experts look at them all, even if that would produce the best results we could possibly hope for. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to produce a text-as-data model. And this model is going to take as its inputs the text of a survey question, and it's going to spit out at the other end the bias of the question. It's impartial. It's consistent. If you run it twice, it's going to give you the same answer. It's scalable. It doesn't care if you ask it one survey question or a million. And it's going to be accurate, which I'm going to show you a little later on. Okay. Yes, please.
So just to kind of like orient, maybe you're going to talk about this. When I think about bias, I think of there being like a reference point of, there's something I'm trying to estimate that is like a parameter.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very clear for like non-response bias. It's like what the mean would have been if I would have sampled everyone, or I had everything. Okay. But so you're going to talk about what that bias is, because the plausibly less biased question requires a subjective knowledge about the bias, and that seems to kind of presuppose, kind of beg the question, right? You have to kind of know what bias is in order to estimate.
Exactly.
Okay.
I'm gonna get to that right now, and then on the next slide as well.
Okay.
So, but just to hint at that, we can think of bias perhaps as an absolute concept in which, as you mentioned, there's some absolute truth. But I'm going to argue that actually we need to think about it in a relative framework. We need to think about bias as in the experimental setup that I mentioned earlier. Bias might only be useful or even possible to measure in reference to some other survey question. So I'll get there in a minute. But first, let's consider perhaps the most classic formulation of survey bias. We have this outcome over here. This is a survey response. It's indexed by both the respondent I and a question Q. Unfortunately, you can only get a survey response in reference to a survey question. Otherwise, this would be a lot easier. We have this theta here. This is a true preference. It's indexed by respondent I. This is going to be respondent I's actual real preference for some policy. Then we have a survey question bias indexed by the question itself, and some measurement error, which is indexed by both. So what we truly care about in classic survey research is going to be the population average preference. That's the average of the y terms, or sorry, the average of the theta terms. But we can't measure that. So what we have to do is we have to take this estimator, which is the sample average response. That's going to be the sum of the yi's, the average of the yi's. Now, for the estimator to be unbiased for the estimate, we need to make a few assumptions. The first is going to be that small n over here is representative of big N that we're going to get from random sampling. We want the expectation of the measurement error to be 0. We generally always have to assume that. But importantly, we have to assume that this beta term is going to be 0. That is, we're saying that there is no survey bias. The question does a perfect job at gauging respondents' true preferences. Now, this is a really tough assumption, even if you put a lot of work into writing your survey question. Even experts who have written hundreds and hundreds of survey questions are not always going to get this one right. So instead, I'm going to reformulate this in a framework of relative bias. I have this tau hat term here, which I'm going to call relative bias. It's indexed by Q1 and Q2. That means that it's the relative bias of Q1 in reference to Q2. Take, for example, Q2 might be our plausibly less biased question in reference to the GOP poll, and Q1 might be the GOP poll itself. Now I'm going to define this as equal to the average response to Q1 minus the average response to Q2. So in some sense, we might consider tau to be a treatment effect. Now, rearranging the previous slide, we can see that this is going to be equal to these three terms here: the difference between the thetas, the difference between the betas, and the difference between the measurement error term. Now, this difference between the betas here, that's our quantity of interest in this case. This is survey bias of Q2 relative to Q1. Now, if we want to capture this using an estimator, yes, Kosuke.
So these two questions are trying to measure the same thing?
Exactly. This only works if they're asking the two questions are asking about the same precise policy.
So why the thetas are different then?
They're not going to be.
Oh.
In practice, I'm going to cancel them out right now.
Oh, okay.
But that's skipping ahead. For this difference in betas to be unbiased, or so to be for the difference in y's to be unbiased for the difference in betas, we need to make some assumptions. Again, we're going to have to assume that our sample is representative of the population. In this case, we have to assume that the sample for both Q1 and Q2 is representative of the population. We again have to assume the measurement error is 0. We have to assume that the thetas are equal, but we get that from randomization, as Kosuke brought up. And this is somewhat comforting. We have a simple experimental setup for estimating survey bias in an unbiased manner, but it still scales really badly. We have to do thousands and thousands and thousands of respondents if we want to estimate this for more than one pair of betas simultaneously. Yes.
In the previous slide, your theta is indexed by I.
Right.
Now,
And this?
yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So in this case, I'm looking at an individual response here. These are going to be average. These are going to be average responses. So we might think that that theta should have a hat on it. If that makes you more comfortable with notation, happy to change that. But I think indexing it by Q1, yeah, that's a good point. I'll add a hat to the theta.
Mixed by Q, right? It should be mixed by just I.
Theta bar here.
Yeah, this is going to be the average theta among the population of respondents who took Q1.
Oh, among the population. Oh.
Which we're assuming those two are going to be the same because we're randomizing between Q1 and Q2. Jason?
So it doesn't seem like it's randomization that's getting you to that. You're asking about the same thing. You are just fixing the theta is your underlying policy preference. So you're just getting that you're asking about the same policy twice.
Sure. But if the population for Q1, for example, is like likely voters, and the population for Q2 is like, you know, all U.S. adults, then those thetas are still going to be different. So we need to randomize.
So we need to draw from the same.
Yeah. So we need both random assignment and representative sampling. Yes.
Can you go back to can you say more about one more slide? So if we ask multiple questions that we think are tapping into the same issue, why don't I just put in question fixed effects, and then the coefficient that's left, like why can't I do factor analysis, right? That seems like this is designed exactly to deal with, that you ask multiple questions on the same issue, the questions themselves will be noisy, and you pull up the preference that remains outside of that. Why won't that framework work here?
That's a great point. There are a few reasons. The first, well, we should mostly talk about this later because I want to get to this stuff a little bit right after this. But the most pertinent reason is going to be that we can't ask the same respondent multiple questions about the same policy area, unless I'm misunderstanding your question. But I think we had a similar misunderstanding last week. So let's talk about this offline. So right, this still scales poorly. So we'd like a method that can estimate this, or some proxy for this, something that correlates really highly for this term at scale. And I'm going to propose to do this using a text model. So consider the following modeling exercise. We'd like to estimate, yes?
Sorry. Can you give me like intuitions to why it doesn't scale? What do you mean by it doesn't scale? I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah. So let's say we'd like to estimate the difference between, we'd like to estimate the relative bias of Q1, Q2, Q3, and Q4.
Oh, so if you have lots of questions,
right.
Okay.
Then what we have to do is we have to randomly assign respondents to all 4 of these different conditions. And then our precision in estimating the precise ordering of those is going to go down really precipitously, unless our survey sample population goes through the roof. For example, if we want to estimate 5 at a time with something like 85% power, you need like 5,000 respondents.
Does that mean like in the first example you had, like a motivating example you had, like you would have like a GOP poll and then there's a Democratic poll and maybe there's many other. So you're trying to estimate the bias of all these different
relative to each other.
Okay.
I mean, in the ideal world, what we would get is a precise ranking of you know, this is the most liberally biased, this is the most conservatively biased, and here's the spectrum.
Okay.
But that's going to be really hard.
Right. Okay.
With this kind of setup because of the survey noise. Yes.
I'm trying to understand if this problem also depends on the scale of the question, like on what scale you ask it. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So, sorry, let me make sure I'm clear on your question. By scale, you mean like 7-point supporter pose versus 5-point. Yeah. So
or even continuous.
Or even some continuous scale. Exactly. Yes. So you're gonna want to standardize across that. There's an extent to which you can kind of bake that in to the text model that I'm going to show you in a minute, but as part of Q1 and Q2 both having to ask about the same policy area, you really do want them to be the results to be on the same scale. Exactly. So consider this modeling exercise. We'd like to train a model to scale text on a spectrum from liberal to conservative using a training set, a test set, and an estimating model. This is a standard setup. A lot of people have done almost this exact same modeling procedure, with my key contribution being a different test set here. So in the training set, we're going to use congressional press releases and newsletters in conjunction with congressional floor speech and congressional ideal points. These two here are going to be our training covariates. This is going to be our training labels, the outcomes. And then as the test set, I'm going to use the Roper Center's iPoll database. There are 1 million survey questions from 1994 to August 2018. about 500,000 of which are unique. And I have all sorts of rich metadata about these that I'm going to get into in a minute. Now, when it comes to using a model to estimate the relationship between lexical word usage in press releases and floor speech and congressional ideal points, as measured by GW Nominate, there's this whole wide world at our disposal. We could use everything from the fanciest deep neural nets to more standard tools like support vector machines or rich regression. But I'm going to keep it simple. I'm going to use a time-tested model called word scores. Word scores has a lot of really important benefits to this application. For example, it has high cross-validation accuracy, which I'm happy to show you a little later. It entails relatively few assumptions. It's computationally very efficient, even for large corpora. It includes baked-in uncertainty estimates. But really importantly, it induces no feature sparsity. So what I mean by that is our training set consists of very long documents. But the test set consists of survey questions, which are often very short snippets. So if we'd like to be able to estimate those with precision, we want to make sure that every word in those count. So if we use something like lasso, which produces a lot of sparsity, so a lot of words don't have any value, it might turn out to be the case that a survey question that we would like to estimate doesn't have any of the words that our lasso has determined are important, and that wouldn't be any good. So we want no feature sparsity in our model, and importantly, we want directly interpretable coefficients. So most machine learning methods don't give us anything close to directly interpretable coefficients, but word scores does.
Why do you care?
We care for a reason that I will show you on the next couple slides, which is that for the sake of researchers who would like to write better survey questions, it'd be useful to know which words in their survey questions are the ones that are contributing to the bias. And so for that, we'd like interpretable coefficient. So here's a short primer on text analysis. The devil is always going to be in the details when it comes to text, so I'm going to go through some of the more fine-grained details and at the same time hopefully give you a deeper understanding for what exactly it is that I'm doing here. The key problem in text analysis is that our data consist of these large documents which are unstructured. And we'd like to turn them into a nice rectangular data set that we all recognize and we can put easily into our data. So the most common way to do this is a term document matrix. The rows of this term document matrix are going to be documents. In this case, each of my documents is all the text from one member of Congress in one term. The columns then are going to be features of the text. These are things like words or pairs of words. And when we're determining how to featureize this text, we have two goals. The first is to maximize the amount of variance we can explain using the set of features we've calculated. And the second is to minimize the absolute number of features for the sake of computational efficiency and lack of overfitting. So we're going to do this using unigrams and bigrams. Here I have a survey question. Do you support or oppose providing a legal way for undocumented immigrants already in the United States to become US citizens? The unigrams in this sentence, for example, are going to be do, you, support, or, etc. We might think that, for example, legal or undocumented or become would be highly salient unigrams in this particular sentence. But we can also include bigrams, which are going to be pairs of words, pairs of sequential words, importantly. Do you support, support or. And I've, again, highlighted some bigrams that we think might be especially useful. When it comes to minimizing the number of features, we want to do a set of pre-processing steps. For example, we're going to stem all the words. That's going to be cutting them up into kind of more primal bits. We're dropping the E from oppose, for example. So all words that start with this are going to be coerced into this word here. We can also remove punctuation and capitalization. Might be problematic sometimes. For example, US is now us. And we're going to remove very rare terms because these are unlikely to show up. And when they do, they're not going to have all that much value. So what we get out of this model is a notion that words have some kind of ideological content. For any given word, we can say, is this word more frequently used by Democrats or conservatives? And oftentimes it looks pretty obvious. Here on the left, I have a set of Republican words. On the right, I have some liberal words. See trust fund and disadvantaged, free enterprise versus safety net, cost billions versus program support, entitlement program versus health coverage, border patrol versus undocumented, pray versus Martin Luther as in King Jr. Yes?
I have a question about the time dimension of this. So
yeah.
your corpus is quite large and it spans 2 decades? Or a decade?
94 to 2018.
Okay, so I'm sure that, the content of political speeches of both parties have changed over time. Perhaps
Very much so.
maybe there's asymmetric polarization. So how do you take care of the time dimension in your project?
Yeah. So in a few slides, I'm going to show you some time trends of how bias in various types of survey questions has changed over time. But that's only one part of the answer to your question. Another part of the answer to your question involves training one model in which the corpus is the entire set of documents from all years, and a different set of models in which I take 3-year windows and see how the bias in, for example, individual words changes over the course of these sets of models. So I'm not going to show you those latter results, but I'm happy to talk about them a little later. The implications, though, are really interesting, and I'd be glad to bring them up in the Q&A.
This is output of the word score.
Yeah. So these are going to be some of the coefficients on the unigrams and bigrams from the word scores model.
Are you gonna review word score model for us, or how are we supposed to go?
I'm happy to. I don't do it in. I'm happy to do it in the Q&A.
Okay.
It's relatively straightforward.
Okay.
Happy to do it. So it's the case that I think any of us would agree that ex ante we would probably be able to say that these are more conservative than these. And so if we're survey researchers and we're trying to write survey questions, we would look at words like free enterprise in a survey question, and we'd be a little bit skeptical, and rightly so. But a lot of the words that we're going to be able to put in our survey questions aren't quite so obvious. So here I have, I'm gonna have a little bit of audience participation, perhaps. I have some pairs of survey words that I've come up with in my corpus. They're all going to have similar sets of divergence between their scores as these pairs, but it's not going to be obvious, at least to me, which is which. So we have agent and police officer. You can think to yourselves which of these you think is liberal and which of these is conservative. And we see, in fact, it's that way. Public schools versus elementary schools, also not super clear ex ante. We have unemployment insurance versus unemployment compensation. Energy resources versus clean energy. Pretty good versus good faith. Support legislation versus support efforts. And all these are going to have similar levels of disagreement to the much more obvious pairs we saw in the previous slides. Yes?
So we really think that a survey question that says good faith is a Republican question? I mean, I would think that a lot of these pairs just don't really have any ideological meaning.
We think that ex ante, certainly. And that's certainly what I think the benefit of my tool is going to be, is that these things that actually have a lot of partisan content that we don't really anticipate, and that maybe if we look at them, we're not quite sure it's the case, but these actually have reasonable effects. For example, here are 2 survey questions which use the this pair here, energy resources versus clean energy. Now, these questions I pulled from the wild. Which of the following do you think is the better approach for the United States to achieve energy independence from foreign oil through the development of renewable energy resources, ... Here's the second question. Please listen to this statement. The effects of our energy choices require that we take timely and decisive steps for renewable, safe, and clean energy on our path to energy independence. The rest of the question asks, do you agree or disagree? Now, the bias of these 2 questions, as measured by my word scores model, is going to be basically the same, with the exception of the highlighted bigrams. And in fact, to the first one with the conservative bigram, 41% of respondents gave the liberal response, whereas in the latter, 75% did. Now, of course, there's going to be some other differences here. For example, survey mode, survey population, that don't make these quite precisely comparable. But hopefully this gives you just something of a glimpse as to some of the value of noting what relevant bigrams might be. Yes, please.
So how do you deal with the word American, Americans, hardworking, which, depending on who it's being applied to and the context, affects if it's a liberal way of talking about a situation or a topic or a conservative way?
So hopefully, a lot of that will be picked up by using bigrams. So hardworking. So the combination of the bigrams, hardworking and working American, or some set of that is gonna be really helpful in that case. Exactly. Yeah, Mike.
So are you saying that the thetas in each of these questions, like the underlying attitude that they're trying to get at, are the same?
Yeah, so you're right that these questions aren't exactly precisely comparable in terms of the thetas. They're as close as I could come up with such that the question bias was identical minus the key bigrams. But you're right, we might think that these thetas are going to be a little different. However, to produce a 34% swing in perceived liberal support, the thetas would have to be really different. So I think certainly there's some component of this difference that's going to be a difference in thetas, but definitely I would argue that part of that component is going to be a difference in the bias of those n-grams.
So you're saying that changing those two words makes the response swing by 30 points? That seems, what we know about how quickly people read survey questions, that seems implausible.
It does. That's right.
Yeah.
And as I've mentioned, there's going to be some other differences in these questions as well. But the broader point is that survey wording really does matter, and often in unpredictable ways. Bo was next.
I'd just like to express some skepticism along the same points. Alan Kerber and friends, their sort of rebuttal of the voter. Are you going to be voting, or are you a voter? That small nuance in actual field experimental contexts produce basically no effects. So I just don't want survey researchers to nitpick at every single word. You know, how big are these? Is this an experiment where there's this big difference, or does it really translate to big differences in the real world context?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I picked these from the wild. These were not quite the same populations. I'm happy to show you the full text and some more details about the survey modes in the appendix slides. But you're totally right that there are a lot of cases in which this difference in word choice isn't really going to make any difference at all. But I definitely argue that there are cases where they do, and I do have some of those a little later on. But how to tell ex ante which case we're in, whether we're in the world of that change in syntax not making a difference, or whether we're in the world where one substitution of word, for example, Obamacare versus Affordable Care Act, can make all the difference in the world. To know that ex ante, we can't simply rely on expert intuition.
Yeah, so I sort of have a philosophical question. Let's say that we have a groups of people who speak differently, use different words about ordinary things, like mass versus service, and some of these people, they're rural, some are urban, some are very educated, some are not so educated, and they kind of vote differently. And do you care in this? I can see how using mass versus service might get different. You might have a completely different interpretation about a non-political question because one group of people understand it one way, another understand it another way. And is that going to show up here? Does it matter if this is just words that speak to your constituency?
So I think, if I'm interpreting your question correctly, what you're asking is whether we expect some of this to be heterogeneous by respondent type. Is that a fair characterization of your question?
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah.
So the short answer is yes, absolutely. I expect that there will be heterogeneity by respondent type. In a survey experimental context, where we're randomly assigning and then assuming that away, I still think these results are going to hold. But in practice, yes, I absolutely think that it's going to be the case that some words are going to interact with unknown respondent dimensions, for example, partisanship or education, in ways that we don't quite anticipate. And the best I can do with this particular setup is to measure mean shifts. So we can imagine a survey question that doesn't produce any mean shift at all, but instead produces a variance shift, like it polarizes respondents, but the mean stays the same. I wouldn't be able to pick that up with this particular framework. There's some Bayesian math I've worked out that can do that I don't present today. But yes, we certainly care about that. It's certainly important. And I can't pick up nearly as much of it in this framework as I would like to. Maya, and then I'm going to move on because we have more stuff to talk about.
Feel free to table this if you've already done it or doing it in future work, but I would hope that you would take this and validate it with survey experiments that kind of do two separate things. One, so I'm kind of on board with the point of this being scoring, like it might be the case that they're just language patterns that emerge among conservative and liberal survey writers, even if they're not particularly loaded in partisan ways, they just like emerge as patterns and are fairly predictive. The other side of it is this effect side, so you could just imagine writing two questions, changing these phrases along a spectrum of partisan loading and see what they actually do to survey respondents for the impact. And then the other side being like, well, do you actually get recognition of these things as partisan terms from respondents? So run it on them to see what they say about whatever the question is asking, but also run it on survey respondents to see if they recognize these types of buzzwords as indicative of being conservative or liberal, because then you get a sense of how much this stuff matters on a few questions.
Yeah, that's a really great idea. I, in fact, do that at the end of the talk.
Great.
Yeah, I have a series of survey experiments I do in which I randomly change some of the words in the survey question and show how my model stacks up. Great. So before I get to that validation, though, I want to show you some of the results that hopefully illuminate some of the value that this model might be able to shed on political science. As I mentioned, I have 500,000 unique survey questions with some really useful metadata. I have the firm which fielded these survey questions. I have the dates on which these questions were fielded. I have topics, human-coded topics, for which under which these questions fall. And in combination with these and bias scores that I've produced, we can answer some really interesting questions. For example, looking at firms, we can explore the relative bias of individual firms, stationary or perhaps how they change over time. And we can also look at topic trends. For example, are discussion of some topics getting more liberal or conservative over time? So this firm-related question might be what Nate Silver would call house effects. So here's a house effects plot. On the left side over here, we have more liberal survey firms on average. On the right, we have relatively more conservative survey firms. And we see some usual suspects. Fox is way up there on the right. Harvard and Yale are down here. We see that the GSS is over here, and the ANES is a little bit over here. Right in the middle, we have Knowledge Networks, Associated Press, Harris Poll, Pew, US News. A lot of this kind of tracks with our intuition. Now, this x=0 line is really important here. As I've mentioned, we don't really think that there's such a thing as an absolute bias term. So instead, what I'm going to do is all these scores are demeaned from the average of all survey questions. So what this is saying is the average question produced by Fox is going to be about 0.15 more DW nominate points, more conservative than the average survey question in my entire sample. Yes?
I have a question about the content of these survey firms and how that might affect the results. So I actually work for the Yale project on climate change communication, which a lot of surveys come from that. And we cover climate change as a topic. We don't cover much of anything else. So there's, sparsity in a lot of the other topics. So how might that affect?
That's exactly right. In fact, I'm glad to know that. That certainly helps to explain why Yale is way all the way over here. But certainly for Kaiser, which only asks questions about healthcare, we would expect that topic trends are absolutely going to influence this. Yeah. To what extent topic selection is the larger component of this, I don't address here. I do address it in a different paper with Mosier et al. But yes, absolutely. I think there's a big topic component here.
Just a minor note, I'm thinking that Harvard, Kaiser, and NPR, for all practical purposes, are the same group there. It's Bob Blendon and folks at the School of Public Health for a lot of those.
Yes.
So those seem similar, and that makes sense to me that Harvard and Kaiser are going to be right together, because if that's the Harvard Opinion Research Project, it's the same goal for all practical purposes.
That's a great point. So a lot of survey questions are in fact fielded by multiple organizations in conjunction. So as a data note, when I encounter one of those, I split it up into its constituent organizations, and I count it as one observation for each. So a poll produced by Harvard and NPR and Kaiser counts as one poll for each. So therefore I can disentangle the relative biases of those. Yeah, Matt.
So I mean I take the point that bias is relative, but so one thing you could do is just why not just get rid of the bias language and just you're pegging this to nominate scores, and so just show us the nominate scores, and especially relative to what senator is what senator is Fox News and or Yale, whatever, to give us a sense in the actual political scale, and then let us determine whether or not how biased that is. Okay, maybe you can do that.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. I don't do it for this plot, but in the software that I've produced, any survey question that you put in it pegs to the nearest center.
Yeah, this like framing this as bias kind of gets you in a pickle because you have to kind of define bias. Whereas if you just kind of frame it as I'm scaling questions to give you the political the political valence content of this question, that seems there's no like if we imagine if we tried to frame DW nominated scores as like the political bias of politicians, we'd seem a lot more partisan.
You're right, that pretty much everything I've shown you so far really kind of conflates this partisan scaling with bias. I'm going to show you some stuff a little later that will hopefully convince you that it proxies bias really well, even if it's not precisely bias. Yes, you have a question?
Yeah, so I have two questions. So to measure the bias, I remember you used congressional speech and press releases for the training set.
Yes.
But can we think so that the test set is a survey question? So it seems you're using a different two domains. So can we assume the ideological orientation in press releases are the same in the survey question?
Exactly, you're right. I'm very much assuming that the ideological content in my training set of congressional text is going to mirror the ideological content in a survey question. I'm going to show a little bit later on that it does hopefully to your satisfaction. And if I haven't convinced you at the end of the talk, bring it up in the Q&A, and I'm happy to see if I can convince you.
Yeah. So if so are you only gauging the ideological bias? Because when we say bias, I think you've shown in the earlier slide that there's like maybe a house effect or cybercrime effect. There's lots of different types of biases. So which biases are you particularly dealing with? Is it only the ideological one?
Primarily, yes, but I can give you some examples a little bit later on in which this would work for not quite just ideological bias. Yes, Matt.
Yeah, just to confirm, like the way as far as I can understand, the way you're doing this is not going to pick up like basically the example that you gave us at the beginning, right? Because you're not using the structure of the you're not using like the response, the constraint on the response categories.
I do use the constraints on the response categories. Yeah.
Okay.
So the actual wording of the response category is fed into the text of the question.
Right, but I mean, you'd only catch it if like Democrats use good, great, like okay, differently than Republicans, right? It's not thinking of the obvious bias of the question, which is the fact that you can only respond positively to about Trump.
But certainly, if you compared the Trump version to the Obama version, it would be able to pick that up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Of course, that's not bias. There's a theta.
You're right. There's some other nuance there that makes that a little bit trickier. Connor?
I had a quick question about the extent to which any one firm might dominate the pool of all of these survey questions. In other words, what fraction of all these questions are coming from NBC versus AP versus Harris, etc.
That's a good question. I don't know that off the top of my head. I know that between the 6 firms that I'm going to highlight a couple slides down the road, they account for about 40% of the surveys in my sample. Cool. So now I'm going to get into a slightly different example of time trends in partisan survey bias. Here, for example, is every question asked since January 1994 about the economy. Each point here is going to be a survey question. This y=0 line is going to be as a baseline, it's the average bias of all survey questions asked about the economy in the first month, January 1994. So we can interpret this lowest line here as divergence from that baseline. We can notice some interesting things here. Some things which are kind of subtle. For example, there's clearly more density of discussion around here. There are some interesting runs of survey questions where the same question or a question with the same bias is asked several days in a row. We can see that most of the variation is in here, but there are questions that are quite far out, both on the liberal and on the conservative side. Now we can partition this into administrations. We see that over here is the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, the Obama administration. And there are distinctly some trends, but they're pretty subtle. We can also look at those trends as broken down by individual survey firms. We have CNN, NBC, CBS, Wall Street Journal, ABC, and New York Times, which I've mentioned collectively account for about 40% of survey questions in the sample. And ABC gets a little bit more conservative in questions about the economy when it comes to pretty late in the second half of Obama. But generally, these lines are pretty flat. This would be comforting. We can here we have it broken down into administrations again. We can also look at questions about George W. Bush. He was not especially beloved by the media, and in fact, we see that there's a little bit of a liberal bias against him. CBS and New York Times, especially after 2002, ask slightly more liberal questions than we would otherwise expect when it comes to George W. Bush. Now, in 2012, The Hill reported the results of their own survey. A plurality of Americans and more than 7 in 10 Republicans say pollsters are intentionally skewing survey results to benefit President Obama. Now, if we look at this same slide over here about Bush, but instead about Obama, we see a distinctly different trend. We see from the start of his term toward the end, questions were getting increasingly conservative in a very dramatic way, in a scale that's many times that of the liberal bias against Bush. The New York Times and ABC, though the data gets sparse over here, are pretty conservative even at the end, and NBC and Wall Street Journal, to their benefit, are turning back toward the baseline of January 2007. So the short answer in response to the Hill's question, no, survey questions about Obama are not intentionally skewed in favor of him. In fact, just the opposite. It kind of looks like surveys are increasingly biased against Obama. Now, this is not the same as saying that they are in absolute terms biased against Obama. It's just saying that in relative to the baseline of questions about Obama prior to the presidential election, they're getting much more conservative.
So here the question wordings are the same over time, or?
Sorry?
The question wordings are the same over time, or are they changing? Or?
So there's going to be a mix of topics in here, which I'll get to in a second. But we, yeah, I think that's.
Because how do you? I guess I'm trying to understand how do you distinguish, changing preferences and changing question wording. Hence the bias changes, right?
Yeah. So certainly it might be the case that we know it's the case that absolute preferences for Obama changed over the course of this period. We have his approval ratings to look at that. This is all independent of that information. So this is simply saying that the language used in survey questions about Barack Obama was increasingly conservative over the course of this period of time.
Yeah, I guess. But how do you identify that?
Is like the year of the training set changing over time, or is it a fixed training set?
So this is a fixed training set. I've run the identical plots with the changing training set that I mentioned in response to Bobo's question a little earlier. The plots look almost identical.
So your conclusion that this is increasingly biased against Obama, since you have no absolute value on the vertical axis, is completely consistent with the survey questions are becoming increasingly fair towards Obama.
So if we think that this baseline over here is actually like incredibly.
It's not a baseline. It's just the average.
If we think that the average of the questions related to Obama in 2007 were in fact very, very liberally biased, like a full point on the DW nominate spectrum, liberally biased, then this trend would essentially take you from there to something like to a zero line, basically.
Right.
But
so when you say they're biased against Obama, you don't have any evidence against that. You have evidence of a change.
So the best evidence I can give you for that is that this baseline here.
It's not a baseline. It's an average.
It's a baseline for the trend line. It's the point of anchoring the trend line to.
How did you calculate the gray dashed line?
So the gray dashed line is simply the average of the bias of all the survey questions asked about Obama prior to 2008.
The average of the ideal points of everything prior to 2008. So we know that the survey is that once Obama was elected, for some reason, survey questions have become increasingly. We need a different word, right? Increasingly tending towards the favoring the
Conservative.
liberal interpretation,
Increasingly
conservative
conservative.
interpretation,
Mhm.
right? But you don't know that it's biased against Obama, and maybe increasingly fair towards Obama, because you don't know where the 0 point is.
Or it might be increasingly fair for a little bit and then going past that to being
You
conservative.
can say it's more biased. Can you say it's we don't know the level of bias, but it's more biased against Obama than the polls under Bush were biased against Bush?
You can certainly say that.
Okay, so you can say relative bias maybe.
Mhm.
You need a language that.
You're right. I should clarify this language a little bit. That's a great point.
Yeah, just to be fair to the unskew the polls people, I don't think their point was that the questions were somehow biased. I think their point was that pollsters were like reweighting the data until they get rid of reweighting data away from Republicans. So
yeah, I can see the point that there are a lot of ways, a lot of tools at pollsters' disposal to skew results other than just writing survey questions in the analysis step and in the weighting step and in all those steps.
Yes.
I certainly can see that point.
You know, I just also point out that one of the things that some of these media organizations do is they test the messages that are being said by candidates. So you'd expect things to also vary with media coverage of political candidates. Maybe Trump got more coverage than who was it 4 years earlier? You know, but there was some salience in that.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. Hopefully, that's some of what I'm picking up in my training set. So I want to do a bit of a deep dive into this trend line here really quickly. Hopefully, you guys will indulge me that. So this is all survey questions about Obama. Not just these big six. This is all survey questions about Obama. And I want to point out some key questions here that might help explain why the trend might be the way it is. The first thing we can see is that there's this big mess of survey questions around here, mostly all prior to 2010, and we don't really see that quite so much over here. We also see some big kind of clusters, survey questions over here and survey questions over here. We see that there are interesting runs of survey questions, including, like this one over here. And then there's an increasingly sparse set of questions that are kind of below the 0.5 line and above the 0 line. So question number 1 down here, do you think Barack Obama cares more about protecting the interests of ordinary working people or cares more about protecting the interests of large corporations? This is the kind of prospective question that characterizes most of the data in this part of the graph. Number 2 is clearly about the election. Please say whether you think each one better describes Barack Obama or John McCain during tonight's debate seemed more like a typical politician. So pretty much all the questions right in here and also right in here are precisely about the election in this kind of formula. Now question number 3 over here, a general characterization of the stuff in this area. Regardless of whether you approve or disapprove of Barack Obama, do you think he has met your expectations for how he would handle his job as president? A lot of these are kind of setting up for the 2016 election. And then question number 4 is really interesting. Do you approve or disapprove of the way Barack Obama is handling the situation with ISIS, Islamic militants in Iraq and Syria? So a lot of the runs of questions up here that appear to be very conservatively biased are questions precisely like this. Yes?
So to me, it seems that from 1 to 4 is mainly due to a change in the topic, right? From economic issue to military issue. And 2 and 3 are mainly neutral questions.
So there's certainly a component of this that's a change in topic. Certainly we see that, for example, there's this little bump down here during the election. We think the election questions are on average, less conservatively biased or less extreme. But the topic composition can't explain the full extent of this. For example, George Bush had essentially the same changes in topic composition. He also had, more election-related questions in election season. He also had more of these question number 3 types immediately prior to the election of Barack Obama. And importantly, the number 4 types of questions, the approve or disapprove of particular policy issues or approve or disapprove of presidency in general, have almost precisely the same bias for Obama and for Bush. So unless we think that surveyors were on average asking more of these relatively later in the term for Obama than they were for Bush, we wouldn't think that that would be able to explain the whole trend.
Is it true?
Yeah.
I mean, they are not asking more later in the term.
Yeah, as best as I can tell. Yeah.
So I guess like I'm struggling a little bit because I'm just trying to figure out like, so this last question, question 4, like what is like, what would you say is like the unbiased way to ask this question that gets at the same that gets at the same theta?
So I can't give you an unbiased way to ask that question.
Or or like a liberally biased.
Right. So it's interesting. I don't have one off the top of my head. I could certainly, for example, like use the software I've written to try and come up with one. I don't have it off the top of my head, but certainly there are ways to do so. Like it'd be hard to imagine that there are not ways to do so.
It's just like some topics are just to describe them, you have to use this language that are just like factual descriptors that maybe are used more often.
So there's a slightly broader answer to that second half of your question that I was hoping to get into later, but a brief answer is that it's not really the case that a survey question has mostly unbiased words or low partisan valence words and then a few high partisan valence words. Really, it's the case that all questions have kind of partisan valence, and what you're looking at is the net partisan valence. So even a question with where some of the mandatory words, the topic words that you have to include, have a high partisan valence, it's certainly possible that you can be careful in your selection of the rest of the words in that question and still end up with a partisan valence in the opposite direction. Please.
So how just related to that, how can we guard this analysis against the fact that maybe Obama is actually, his politics are going more towards conservative, and the questions that are being asked are sort of just on point of what Obama's already doing. I mean, 2008 you had the crisis, the large financial crisis where there were large bailouts and the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. So they're like politics of Obama. How can we guard against that here?
Interesting. So you're saying that perhaps the topic compositional shift that we expect is around here we had mostly questions about the economy, and around here the economy is doing better. We don't have so many questions about the economy anymore. That certainly might be the case. In fact, I have some data based on just anecdotal data based on my readings of a lot of these questions that there were, as you suggest, more questions about the economy over here than there were over here.
And even on top of that, Obama is actually moving more towards conservative politics or policy. Could we say anything about that?
That's a matter up for debate. I wouldn't say that I fully agree with that supposition, but
as a thought experiment, I mean, assume that he would go towards more conservative politics, but like, how would that show in your method here?
So, how it would show in the method is different than the answer to the question that I have off the top of my head, which is that we would expect then the opposite trend for George Bush. We would expect that as the economy got worse toward the end of his term, that his trends would go more toward neutral. We don't observe that. But in general, you're definitely right that this is victim to changes in topic composition. Yes, okay.
So ideally, I guess what we want is like alternative words that are or phrases that have essentially the same semantic meanings, but different partisan sort of biases.
Exactly.
And that would be awesome, because if somebody writes a question and then your model says, well, in order to reduce this bias, use this phrase instead.
So that's absolutely what my software is designed to help you do.
Oh, okay.
And to get at that a little bit, I want to briefly, I'm running out of time already. I'm going to briefly go over the validation study to basically get at that. So I'm going to run a survey experiment, which is going to be exactly the same experimental setup that I mentioned earlier, involving randomly assigning within one pool of respondents different questions about the same topic. So I have 1,000 respondents, 750 of them are from MTurk, 250 are from DLabs. And I'm going to ask them questions across 4 issue areas. within each issue area, I'm going to write a set of questions that are entirely the same except with some setup. And the setups are going to change the questions such that they range from very liberal to very conservative. All responses are going to be on a 5-point supported or proposed scale for the sake of comparability and interpretability. And then all I'm going to do is I'm going to aggregate these responses. So I'm going to say whichever question within each issue area produces the most, on average, liberal response, I'm going to call that the most liberal question. Whichever produces the most conservative response is going to be the most conservative question. I'm going to be able to rank all the questions within issue area from most liberal to most conservative. And then I can see how those ranks stack up with the ranks produced by my model. But importantly, I want to know how well I do, not just in absolute terms, but also as in comparison to what we might consider to be best practice. And that's going to be aggregations of experts. So I run a small study. I get 12 public opinion researchers and political scientists, and I ask them the following prompt. The following questions will be randomly assigned to an online survey sample. Rank them from liberal to conservative according to their average response. So in essence, I'm asking these experts to predict the outcome of this experiment. Now, I want to start by noting that they have really poor intercoder reliability. This is a flaw of pretty much any expert aggregation survey. Experts tend not to agree with each other very well. I think we'll see that in this room very quickly. Here, for example, is the gun control topic. Each of these questions, this question starts with, we should require mental health checks before anyone can purchase a firearm. But then there are also two different setups. Even considering the importance of protecting oneself, we should require background checks. Even considering the importance of the Second Amendment, protecting the right to bear arms, we should require background checks. So the revealed rank, according to the survey, this produces the most liberal response, this is the second most, this is the most conservative average response. Which just means that more people on average supported the liberal policy position when given this question as compared to this one, as compared to this one. Now my model actually predicts exactly the same rank. My model ranks this as being the most liberal, this is the most conservative, or this is the most conservative, and this is in the middle. And interestingly enough, the experts all agree. The aggregate rankings of all the experts in this case indicate that this is the most liberal, this is the most conservative, and this is in between. So this is comforting. I think we can all agree, just anecdotally looking at this, that this kind of makes sense. But it's not always the case that the experts do well. For example, in the medical marijuana question, my model correlates at 0.2, the experts at negative 0.4. And it's even worse for the immigration question, in which the experts correlate with the results only at negative 0.8. Which is not to say that experts are useless. As I've already shown, experts can do quite well in certain contexts. But partially as a result of poor intercode reliability, it's going to be the case that the aggregation of these experts doesn't always hit the mark. Now, certainly within my pool of 12 experts, some of them are going to hit the mark. Some of them, I think 2, got exactly right the correct order. But enough of them got the wrong order that the aggregate result of those experts was not very good. Yes, please.
I have a normative question based on this
My favorite.
lack of sort of the difference between what the experts think versus what the public or observers think.
Reveal.
Reveal. So you run into this problem on Facebook where people who monitor what people post would flag something as, potentially harmful and malicious, whereas the Facebook audience might say, it's not so bad. So at what point should we be held responsible to the biases of the public or the ignorance of the public?
Yeah, that's a really deep question.
Are you all the experts?
No.
That's a really deep question. It's really interesting to think about. And the normative implications of this project writ large are admittedly hit or miss. So for example, one way to think about this project is a way of helping researchers write, less relatively biased questions, or to help journalists take relatively biased questions and identify them. But another way to look at this project is helping push pollers write more biased questions. Though, of course, if they do so using my tool, then journalists also using the tool are capable of identifying that. But I agree that the normative implications of biased survey questions and how far we as researchers actually have to go to make sure we're doing the best job we possibly can. Like what standard do we need to hold ourselves to? I mean, I'd argue as high as we practically can. And I think the larger part of this project that I'd like researchers to adopt is that I'm making it cheaper to help researchers do a better job at that. So whereas before we have to go through extensive pre-testing and focus group testing, and if we do some focus group testing and find that our question isn't quite doing the thing we want it to, we don't really know why. And the best we can do is write some more questions, do some more pre-tests, do some more focus grouping. And hopefully this helps both improve the quality of each iteration and reduce the time. That was perhaps an overly large answer to your question, but I'd love to talk about it a little more. I think it's super interesting. So just to wrap up real quick, here's a glimpse of the software. Over here, do you approve or strongly approve of this application? We have distribution here. We have the question is pretty much right there. Nearest senator is Joe Manchin. And as much as I would love to give you the link, which is right here, I kind of broke it while I was messing with it last night. It'll be ready by the time I give an actual job talk. So I think in this project I made a few contributions. Briefly outline them. The first is a validated and scalable text model and some software, hopefully eventually, to estimate survey question partisanship. I have a newly available data set, which I've produced with help from the Roper Center, full of survey questions and metadata and their biases. I'd love researchers to look at some of these trends over time and help me with the decomposition of topics. And I have this weird finding that survey language kind of changed during the Obama presidency. I know a bunch of things that didn't lead to it, especially when we consider the Bush presidency in comparison, but there's definitely something there. I have some follow-up projects that I briefly want to mention. The first is survey drop-offs and item non-response. I'm working with the CCES and the Harris poll. We might think, for example, that if a conservative survey respondent sees a really liberal question, they're more likely to either item non-respond or just to stop the survey altogether. Hopefully, if we can identify these before they happen, we can increase our response rates in surveys. As well, I've only thus far considered partisan bias in surveys, but the method is just as transferable to racial or gender biases. And finally, I'd like to look at different different test sets. For example, looking at the partisan bias of news articles and perhaps the relationship between those and outcomes as measured with Facebook data, if Gary helps me get anything. Anyway, thanks for your attention. Look forward to more of your questions. Yeah.
So I guess one thing that's a little confusing about at least the presentation is that the connection between the kind of, I guess, the structural model that you were giving at the beginning about what bias is, and then what the estimation procedure that you had to do.
Quick question: Is this a
No, this is like a real. This is like a
okay.
Not a. I mean, it might lead to some comment on the presentation, but
okay.
So, but I like what. So from what you were showing us, in order to estimate bias, you need to compare questions that have a similar theta value, right? That are asking about the same thing. So I guess and that's what's going to get at this bias. I mean, that was the kind of the point of that structural model you're doing at the end.
Yeah.
But I don't quite understand how this model that doesn't take into consideration question, the content of the question, or the theta value, how it's actually going to estimate bias. It seems like it's going to combine those two things when it actually does the estimation, unless you're somehow giving it information about theta.
Yeah, there's definitely an extent to which, for example, these plots here are looking not actually at the theta, but the theta plus the beta.
Yeah,
you're right. And the best I can try to do is to decompose these trends into their constituent topics.
Yeah.
And look within those topics. So I'd really like to be able to say that questions about Obamacare are getting more conservatively biased. I definitely can't say that 100%. Definitely, it might be the case that what I'm actually observing here is partially a change in that and partially a change in what topics people are asking about President Obama. Now, one thing I've been doing to get at this is, as you know, the Roper Center questions have tags, so I can look at how this line changes with questions that are tagged with Obama and healthcare, or Obama and the economy, or just Obama. And interestingly, they look mostly the same. The data is a little sparser, and they don't look quite as good for this plot. But even within Obama and healthcare questions, there's going to be some variation in what the questions are, such that the thetas aren't always going to be quite as comparable as we'd like.
I mean, and just to be clear, I mean, I think the estimation procedure seems fine for doing the kinds of things you're doing, like house bias and stuff like that. I mean, it seems reasonable for those questions. It just doesn't as much seem like as feasible for the kinds of the motivation, which was like individual survey questions. And so this is just,
Yeah. The other
There's something to think about. You don't have to you just take more questions.
I want to address it at least a little bit to start, which is certainly I agree that there's going to be some measurement error, and that using this to estimate the bias of a single question is going to be a little bit finicky. So, which is why I'm still working on improving the app, getting the precision as tight as I can. Yes, ma'am.
So I was able to go to the link to your app, but you're saying that even if we're able to visit the app, that information that's coming out is not something that we should consider?
Yeah, it has the wrong predictive model on the back end right now.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
All right. Yeah, because I was going to ask you questions about like what is popping up when I put in some of my survey questions.
I'm happy to talk with you after this about what it looks like, because the front end's not going to change. It's only the back end that will. So I'm happy to go through it with you and show you how to interpret some of the outputs.
Right.
And also to take your feedback on how to make it clearer.
Right. And are your word scores basically word spec scores? No, they're different. Okay. And then are you going to make your training set available for people?
Yeah. So the training set is certainly available. So all the training data that I've acquired is already publicly available. I haven't done anything fancy. I haven't stolen any data.
No, but
for this project.
Yeah, it takes work to go and get all those press releases, so if that's already available, if you can make it,
Absolutely.
more widely known to
Absolutely.
us, we appreciate it.
Yeah, I deeply committed to replication and transparency. All this is going to be, a bunch of this is on GitHub already. As much of it as possible will be on the Harvard Dataverse as soon as I can. Yes.
So can you talk a little bit more about how your conclusions here and your tool should help us select a question? Because we care about this question, right? Because we think there is a true theta and we want to ask a question that can get at that.
Right.
But all the stuff you presented today was relative, I guess. So how does this method add to reading the literature and things like that and selecting a question that gets at theta?
So certainly it's no substitute for reading the literature. Certainly I would never recommend that we don't read the literature and instead just rely on some black box machine learning methods. But you're right that I haven't exactly thought through what I think the ideal workflow is for writing a perfect question. It's certainly going to vary based on what the format is. But certainly if you have a question in mind, I would recommend plugging it in, seeing what some of the highest valence terms are, seeing what might substitute for those, and possibly randomly assigning between a couple versions of them if they're pretty close. That's at least at the minimum I would recommend something like that. Yes.
Yes, I have a little question about the generalizability from say political polls to surveys. So a lot of the survey bias literature looks at bias with questions of things like how many hours did you sleep last night, when was the last time you went to see a doctor? And so things where we think there's a true objective result, so we think these things are objective. And then we have other latent variables like consumer confidence, customer satisfaction, lots of surveys that don't really match things that people are particularly talking about in Congress. And those are similar to public opinion and that they're latent. You mentioned you might be able to generalize this to things like gender, immigration. How far further do you think you can go?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, how far could I? So the limit is going to be the quality of the training set and the quality of the training labels. DW nominate is really nice because we have a lot of faith in the DW nominate scale. We think the labels are pretty much accurate. There's not a lot of noise there. If we wanted to measure, if we wanted a training set that kind of like got at consumer satisfaction, we would need a big training set of a lot of texts of very happily satisfied consumers, not very satisfied consumers. That seems totally plausible. I think a lot of firms already have that data, and that would be pretty easily transferable actually.
If it was how many hours I slept last night?
So for a question for how many hours I've slept last night, yeah, you'd have to consider what type of, like, what the dimension of underlying characteristic it is that biases that. Like, it's certainly not partisan bias. It's probably not gender or race bias. It might be, I don't know, like work ethic type. Like if we had a set of documents of people who were talking about lots of really, lots of work ethic versus work-life balance or something, then we might be able to get at something like that. I'd be really interested to try it.
Yeah.